Hello, welcome to the first video discussion of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. For the purposes of these videos, I will be referring to this edition of Black Skin, White Masks. I believe it's the Grove Press edition, translated by Richard Philcox. So that's what I'll be referring to throughout this series, and in this video particularly. I just want to start out by situating Fanon a little bit before we get into a discussion of language in the first chapter. You'll notice that the book begins with a quote from the poet, writer, philosopher, politician César from his discourse on colonialism. César and others, including Senghor from Senegal, César himself was from Martinique, the same island in the Caribbean that Fanon is from, were involved in a Pan-African philosophical movement, the Negritude movement. And you can tell by that word, one, it's a focus on black identity, and also a focus on the sort of attitude and orientation of black people toward their identity in part, but also in relation to the situation that they find themselves in the world. So this is probably at least in Fanon's context, I think this is the dominant mode of philosophizing in the world of the African diaspora and among these thinkers. It was hugely influential and an important movement, especially for various kinds of black nationalism and within liberation movements that were fighting against colonization. I mean, obviously, César, Discourse on Colonialism, is talking about not only the effects of colonialism on the populations that live under it, but also the effects on the colonizer. And Fanon is interested in this two-way effect of the oppression of the colonized people, and then that effect on the colonizer, the oppressors as well. So there's an interesting double emphasis on the dual effects throughout these thinkers. Fanon is both very influenced by and critical of the Negritude movement, and we'll see that because he adopts a lot of existentialist and develops an existentialist theory and way of doing psychology and of practicing politics and so on, Fanon is critical, I would say, mostly of what he views as a essentializing feature of the Negritude movement, that there's something like an essence of blackness or the soul of black folks, to borrow another phrase. The idea that black people around the world, in Africa and in the African diaspora broadly, whether it's in the United States or the Caribbean or Latin America or wherever, the idea that there had to be a reclamation of black identity from whiteness and from the white-dominated discourses of Western and European culture was everywhere. I mean, Elaine Locke, who I believe was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar, wrote a book called The New Negro that tackles this theme. Du Bois, the Souls of Black Folk. It's a lot of meditation and philosophizing on what it meant to be black and to perform and operate in a society where you are burdened with this identity marker, and to try to interpret it in such a way that it didn't have to be viewed as a burden, right? I mean, already that language of oppression already just seeps into our talking about these kinds of traditionally marginalized identities. And so there's a lot of discussion about how do we reclaim that? How is that reclaimed from the hands of the oppressors? And Fanon particularly views blackness as a product of a white colonial culture, that the conceptual class of being black doesn't emerge organically out of the groups of people identified by that class, that it is a product, and particularly a product of colonization and the slave trade and other things that seek to dehumanize black people for the purposes of enslaving them and forcing them into labor, if not under explicit forms of slavery like chattel slavery in the American South, then other kinds of forced labor. Like we saw in Sartre's discussion of colonialism in Algeria, once the land becomes possessed by the Europeans, by the French, then people who had formerly worked that land as theirs, or who had held it in common, now have to work the same land under sort of forced conditions where the products of the land are not being grown to suit their needs, but are being grown for the foreign French market, wine instead of wheat, and that kind of thing. So Fanon is interested in this idea of how does one become black or white or any of those identity categories that have been fashioned under the political and economic system of colonialism and capitalism attendant on colonialism. And how does it get taken back and reformed? Remember, Sartre, in his introduction to The Wretched of the Earth, has this moment where he talks about the violence of revolutionary politics in liberation movements is man reconstructing himself. So the process of this reconstruction, because again, the idea that under the system of colonialism and the capitalist exploitation of the labor that attends colonialism, there's no place within that system for one who is identified as black to become fully human if the terms of that system are accepted. And so what is required is a dismantling of the system and a reformation of the class of person that is identified as black or whatever. So this is a big part, I think, of Fanon's overall project. And again, what he is going to criticize and push back on when dealing with the Negritude movement is what he views as essentializing features. Sartre also has written on the Negritude movement, particularly in Black Orpheus, and you can see even in Sartre, who is the kind of strident anti-essentialist par excellence, Sartre himself lapses into essentializing language about the closeness to the earth of the black man and all of this kind of stuff, right? So even Sartre is susceptible, highly susceptible to this essentializing idea, right? Sort of contrary to his own admitted philosophical commitments. So that's one thing that we're going to see in Fanon, is both an inspiration and a criticism of the Negritude movement. That there are many good videos on YouTube and in other places that you can look to learn a little bit more about the Negritude movement. I can't unfortunately get sort of too far into it because that would take us off track with Fanon, but I think it's very important to sort of get the basic idea of the Negritude movement to sort of understand the philosophical context that Fanon is operating in, especially from within the African diaspora and the Pan-African movement. And again, you can see, in the United States, manifestations of this push to reclaim identity in the Black is Beautiful movement and all of that kind of stuff. So again, those are tangential topics, but interesting ones worth, I think, discussing. Since he starts Black Skin, White Masks with a poet, someone known for their poetry anyway, not exclusively a poet, Black Skin, White Masks starts with a kind of almost poetic structure of short one-line sentences that sort of declare I wouldn't say necessarily the goals of the book, but what the book strives for, without maybe assuming that it can be accomplished. So why am I writing this book? Nobody asked, especially not those for whom it is intended. So in all serenity, my answer is that there are too many idiots on this earth, and now that I've said it, I have to prove it. Striving for a new humanism, understanding mankind, our black brothers, I believe in you, man, racial prejudice, understanding and loving. So some of the motivation and the striving of the text is outlined in this sparse, almost sort of proclamations, right? I believe in you, man, and man being capitalized there. So seeking to achieve the kind of universalism that was promised under liberal humanism, but which failed and was never achieved. And of course we've talked in other videos about Sartre's preface to Wretched of the Earth, for instance, about the hypocrisy of liberal humanism, and so on. So I will say also that Fanon uses sometimes the gender exclusive language of man, and there, I think in the beginning, perhaps meaning mankind, humanity, broadly speaking, so using the gender non-inclusive word in a broader sense to perhaps include all of humanity. But I think in other parts of the text, Fanon is talking about black men, and especially in chapters that we'll get into later about the sexual relationships between couples of different racial identities, we'll see that a lot of what he's doing here is talking about black men in a non-universal, generalized way, but as gendered. So in some sense, I think it's possible but not necessary to read Black Skin, White Masks as a sort of precursor to what we now call intersectional analysis, where he understands that there are gender dynamics that are inflected through race, and race is related to gender in certain ways, and so on and so forth. Certainly that is a bit anachronistic. Intersectional theory is not developed until much later, but I think it could be a useful but certainly not necessary heuristic to sort of understand a little bit what Fanon is doing, especially when his focus is on black men particularly. There's a strong tendency amongst existential thinkers, and Fanon included here, to speak from their own experience. So Beauvoir writes a book on women, The Second Sex, What is a Woman? And as she starts to get a little bit older and experiences the death of her parents and stuff, she turns to look at old age and things like that. That book by Beauvoir is translated as The Coming of Age, and so on. They're all involved in writing sort of memoirs and fiction that's based upon their own experiences and so on. And I think Fanon is not unusual to talk about the thing about which he has some experience. Right? Now, I do think there are some instances of sexism and misogyny in the book, and we'll talk about that. It's not free of any type of prejudice or anything, of course. So the treatment sometimes of gendered issues can be fraught. I don't think that we need to throw anything out, or some things maybe. Well, again, we'll talk about these issues when we encounter them in the text. I don't think it's a baby with bathwater type of situation. It's just a critical reading. I mean, any philosophical text, as I've been stressing, and as I always stress when we read this type of philosophy particularly, always read with a sort of critical eye, sensitive to issues that will crop up around the problems of race and gender and so on. So that will provide some interesting food for thought for us. Speaking of sensitivity to that kind of language, the very first chapter, of course, is about language. And the very first line of the first chapter, Fanon opens, "We attach a fundamental importance to the phenomenon of language, and consequently consider the study of language essential for providing us with one element in understanding the black man's dimension of being for others. It being understood that to speak is to exist absolutely for the other." So there again already, opening paragraph of the first chapter, there is a clear existential connection of this being for others, an acknowledgement that you're speaking as an address to, you speak for others, and that your speaking is a way in which you appear to the other, appear as an object to them. And so it's primarily for the other that I appear as white. I don't really think of myself as white most of the time, but it's unavoidable that when I present to other people, I appear as white. And that's a dimension of my social existence that I have to be sensitive of, even if I don't myself think in terms of my whiteness often. Although, of course, I do, from time to time, have to sort of think of myself that way. I can't escape it. So there's a move that people make, I think, disingenuously, is a little bit of bad faith in modern discourse to try to be colorblind, to say, oh, I don't see color. Well, that's kind of bullshit, right? Because we live in a racialized society, and so these things are sort of forced on us in significant ways. We appear to each other and have to navigate racialized spaces that are color-coded in important ways. And so there's some sense in which, even if we would like to get beyond it, we can't. And this is also a feature of the revolutionary politics surrounding issues of blackness and language, color racialized language. In order to be liberated, one has to destroy these identity markers in a way. So even if we're not liberated from them or free from them right now, the end goal is to destroy the category and the opposition between whiteness and blackness. So this is a sort of a long-term, future-oriented revolutionary goal that is perhaps yet to come, and we can't just declare it to be accomplished, but the idea is that to enter into the brotherhood of humanity, the fraternity. Well, see, all of these are gendered language. All of these are gendered terms. So fraternities, gendered, all that. To enter into that category of humanity with other people, broadly speaking, blackness must be sort of destroyed qua blackness. Again, because Fanon is going to see it as a product of white culture and whiteness, as to other, the person to be oppressed. Language is going to play an important role in that, and language plays an important role in the dynamics of colonialism. To usurp the culture of the colonized people and to deny them, we take from them their indigenous language and give to them the language of the colonized. And this is a large, education plays a large role in this. He talks at length about people being sent away. He lays it out on the second page. The problem we shall tackle in this chapter is as follows. The more the black Antillean assimilates the French language, the whiter he gets. That is, the closer he comes to becoming a true human being. We are fully aware that this is one of man's attitudes faced with being. A man who possesses a language possesses as an indirect consequence the world expressed and implied by this language. You can see what we are driving at. There is an extraordinary power in the possession of a language. Paul Valéry knew this and described language as the god gone astray in the flesh. So, all colonized people, Fanon goes on to say. In other words, people in whom an inferiority complex has taken root, whose local cultural originality has been committed to the grave, position themselves in relation to the civilizing language, that is, the metropolitan culture. The more colonized the assimilated cultural values of the metropolis, the more he will have escaped the bush. The more he rejects his blackness and the bush, the whiter he will become. In the colonial army, and particularly in the regiments of the Senegalese soldiers, the native officers are mainly interpreters. They serve to convey to their fellow soldiers the master's orders, and they themselves enjoy a certain status. So the cultures that are being colonized largely at this stage are agrarian cultures, and the process of industrialization within these agrarian cultures is ramped up by the forces of colonialism, because the agrarian culture is to be exploited for the raw goods that will be sent back to the mother country for industrial production, and then the products made in the mother country are sent back to the colonies for consumption by the colonizers, by the people, French nationals and so on, living in the colonies. This requires some metropolitan area, some city area to grow up within the colony, but it can't become the sort of metropolitan centers that you have in Paris. And so, insofar as any of the indigenous population or the native population is going to be educated, they're largely going to be sent back to Paris or wherever, Lyon, to learn. And there they're going to be, their nativeness, their agrarian, countrified ways of being are going to be effaced and replaced with the French culture, the metropolitan culture of the city. This is not unusual, I think, even for people who are from rural areas, even within the United States, who become educated. I know students all the time that they come to college, they learn things, they learn ways of talking, they ways of speaking with one another, they meet people from around the world. They go home and they feel somewhat alienated. They feel this distance between themselves and their family, who aren't experiencing this educational journey that they're on. And so there becomes to be a disconnect between their home and what they're learning in the university. I myself worked to minimize the accent that I have. I'm from a poor rural area in Appalachia, and I began the process of trying to normalize my speech patterns to get rid of this accent. And it comes out a little bit more. My spouse always tells me, "Oh, you just talked on the phone with your parents for an hour or whatever, your accent is coming back more strongly." In certain words, it is always there. There's always like a little bit of a tell in the language. So this language becomes then a wedge to create divisions within the colonized people, but also to change and shape the attitude and identity of the people who are undergoing this education, to assimilate them. And there you can see the example of the captain, or of the officers in the Senegalese army, operating as translators. This now is understood in terms of like a code switching, that people will talk one way with one group of people, and then they talk another way with another group of people, and they can serve, if you have to switch back and forth between these different modes of discourse in different communities, you sometimes have to play the role of interpreting between the two. Now, it's particularly pernicious in the example that Fanon is giving, because the translation is coming in the form of an order. You're translating the order of the master to the servant in that position, and so on. So there's a power dynamic there that makes it somewhat pernicious, right? So there's also this idea that the effect of going to become educated and learning this language is to enter into what Fanon calls the holies of holies. It's supposed to elevate you to a higher status, again, to bring you closer to the status of being human. In the so-called bush, in the countryside, you're living at a level sort of below the surface of humanity. You're closer to a brute or to an animal there than when you're in the metropolitan, in the city, in the polis, to take it back even to the Greeks, who understood their identity as human beings to be wrapped up in their political place within the polis, within the city. And so to go to the city is supposed to be an elevating action. It's supposed to bring you closer into the the category of human being. The black man entering France changes because for him the metropole is the holy of holies. He changes not only because that's where his knowledge of Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire comes from, but also because that's where his doctors, his departmental superiors, and innumerable little potentates come from. The staff sergeant 15 years on the job to the gendarme from Panisserie, there's a kind of spell cast from afar. And the black man who leaves in 1 week for the metropole creates an aura of magic around him, where the words Paris, Marseille, the Sorbonne, Pigalle represent the high points. On departure, the amputation of his being vanishes as the ocean liner comes into view. So there's, again, that creation of a fissure or a disconnect, that there's a kind of a transformation, envisioned at least, where this happens. And the things that they do back home, they forget them or they become critical of them, that people shouldn't do things this way. He uses the anecdote, the Creole folktale of the, after having spent several months in France, a young farmer returns home. On seeing a plow, he asks his father, "An old don't pull that kind of thing on me, peasant. What's that thing called?" By way of an answer, the father drops the plow on his foot and his amnesia vanishes. Awesome therapy. The issue of the Creole language being used at home and then learning sort of quote-unquote proper French, and the forbidden use of Creole becomes an increasing focus of Fanon's analysis here, because you're supposed to speak right. And we know that there's a kind of racist canard of, oh, they're so well spoken, how articulate they are. Whenever a black person or a person from any sort of marginalized group learns to speak in the dialect and in the manner of the oppressor, the group that's in power. And I often caught, when I taught for a time at Cheney, which is a historically black university, and there was a lot of discussion about the role of language in their life, and that one of the things that they're learning to do is basically speak properly, to learn a kind of white vernacular to enter the professional world, and to write in a professionally acceptable way, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of interesting discussion, and a lot of stark differences between groups that are raised in the city of Philadelphia versus out along the main line in the suburbs and so on, because there's already established linguistic differences between how they communicate, again, within their different groups, the kind of code switching going on. So again, this is a problem that Fanon is discussing here on the use of language to create these social divisions, and how language transforms a person. Learning a new language makes you sort of different in a way when it's a factor that you use in your life to navigate different social, not just the esoteric or the academic learning of a language for some scholarly purpose, but learning a language to meaningfully navigate social spaces and establish differences and hierarchies between groups that you interact with. Another great text that discusses this problem that is more contemporary is Gloria Anzaldúa, Light and Darkness. I think is a really good text that talks about having to move between the margins, move in the in-between spaces between different social groups. So I'd recommend checking out that. Gloria Anzaldúa, her work on the borderlands, La Frontera, is also a really good text. But I'm thinking in this instance on discussing language of light and darkness. There. Fanon discusses this change of being. Where does this change of personality come from? What can this new way of being be ascribed to? Any idiom is a way of thinking, right? The fact that the newly returned Martinican adopts a language different from that of the community in which he was born is evidence of a shift and a split. Okay, so there's where we get what I've already been discussing. And this idea of evolving toward humanity, a little further down on that page, We have known, and unfortunately still know, comrades from Dahomey or the Congo who say they are Antillean. We have known and still know Antilleans who get annoyed for being taken for Senegalese. It's because the Antillean is more evolved, is more evolved than the African, meaning he is closer to the white man. And this difference exists not only on the street or along the boulevard, but also in the administration and the army. So again, the idea that the usurpation of the indigenous language and its replacement by the language of the colonizers is seen from the perspective of the people colonized as a mode of improvement. Right? Fanon has been focusing on what he calls an inferiority complex among the colonized, that by being marginalized and having their land taken and being placed under the rule of the colony, that they've been knocked down a peg and relegated to a class of people where the whole discourse of the colony makes them less than human. And so the striving to replace the way that they talk in their local communities with the language of the metropolis with the proper French or standard English or whatever the example you want to choose is supposed to be seen as a phase in evolution toward the class of humanity, being finally included in humanity. But of course, this is the sort of trick. This is the part of the cruelty of colonialism, is that it will instill this inferiority complex in the psychology of the colonized, present them with a supposed path to self-improvement, and yet because of the very nature of their classification as black or as Arab or whatever the case may be, actually forbid that movement and that improvement to them. Again, so colonization operates on these false promises. Back to the idea of the gift that we discussed with Sartre and that preface to The Wretched of the Earth, right? That is, I think, a big part. The role that language plays in creating these rifts and differences amongst the people who are being subject to colonization, and the kind of conflict that it creates within them, that they have to live this paradox of striving for self-improvement or supposed self-improvement while being systematically denied the actual concrete improvement there, right? Again, Fanon makes this link to evolution a couple of times. He says, we have said that the black man was the missing link between the ape and man, the white man, of course, and only on page 108 of his book does Sir Alan Burns come to the conclusion we are unable to accept as scientifically proven the theory that the black man is inherently inferior to the white, or that he comes from a different stock. Let us add that it would be easy to prove the absurdity of such statements as, the Bible says that the black and white races shall be separated in heaven as they are on earth, and the natives admitted to the kingdom of heaven will find themselves separated to certain of our fathers' mansions mentioned in the New Testament, or else we are the chosen people, look at the color of our skin, others are black or yellow because of their sins, and so on. By appealing therefore to our humanity, to our feelings of dignity, love, and charity, it would be easy to prove and have acknowledged that the black man is equal to the white man, but that is not our purpose. What we are striving for is to liberate the black man from the arsenal of complexes that germinated in a colonial system. And then he talks about the way in which black people are spoken down to. The way that people, again, to go back to that idea of code switching, the way that when faced with a black patient, the doctor changes how they address them, and how Fanon, as a sort of small gesture of resistance, refuses to do this. He refuses to lean over to address, for instance, the poor 73-year-old dementia patient that he sees in his medical practice, right? And he even says that you have to understand that people who have a hard time interacting with you in the language that you're used to have their own language in the background. He says, when I meet a Russian, a German or a Russian speaking bad French, I try to indicate through gestures the information he is asking for, but in doing so I am careful not to forget that he has a language of his own, a country, and that perhaps he is a lawyer or an engineer back home. Whatever the case, he is a foreigner with different standards. There is nothing comparable when it comes to the black man. He has no culture, no civilization, and no long historical past. Perhaps that is why today's blacks want desperately to prove to the white world the existence of a black civilization. And again, here you can see this movement to try to show that, Africa has a history, that there are great kingdoms in Africa and so on and so forth. An effort to show that no, there is this culture. But again, under colonialism, that has been systematically denied. I mean, you can just look at Hegel, that whole Africa has no history line, very standard sort of tropes. This is supposed to be part of the gift that's being brought to the colonizers. It's incorporating them into the grand movement of history that's exemplified by Europe and so on. So Fanon sees this as a kind of a trap. I think to try to win that kind of approval and recognition is perhaps wrong-headed in the eyes of Fanon. That the system and the language that's being used to negotiate the colonial system is not going to acknowledge black history and so on and so forth. Again, you have the liberal tendency of tokenization, Black History Month, so on and so forth, where the contributions, but it's always contributions of black people to Western society that is being upheld during those sorts of celebrations. But there's not really like a full integration into the main history being taught, right? I think that this is the kind of tension that Fanon is foreshadowing and really talking about in terms of like the way that we talk about and the way that our language structures our understanding of these issues here. Whether he likes it or not, Fanon goes on, the black man has to wear the livery of the white man has fabricated for him. And then he gives examples from comic books, from movies, where he shows the sort of servile role to which the black person is relegated in these forms of media and in these cultural expressions. How, again, the black person always has to be one of the good ones, servile, caricatured in certain ways, and that is the sort of form of blackness in the eyes of the white master. And there's only so much kind of improvement you can do. Again, that's why the book is Black Skin, White Masks. This effort to educate and to fit in and to adapt the standards of white culture is a sort of play acting that Fanon is going to be critical of. Again, speaking to this rebellion, after everything that has been just said, which is pretty dire, right? After everything that has just been said, it is easy to understand why the first reaction of the black man is to say no to those who endeavor to define him. It is understandable that the black man's first action is a reaction, and since he is assessed with regard to his degree of assimilation, it is understandable, too, why the returning Antillean speaks only French and not Creole. Because he is striving to underscore the rift that has occurred. He embodies a new type of man, whom he imposes on his colleagues and family. His old mother no longer understands when he speaks of her PJs, her ramshackle dump, and her lousy joint, all that embellished with the appropriate accent. In every country in the world there are social climbers, those who think they've arrived, and opposite them there are those who keep the notion of their origins. The Antillean, returning from the metropole, speaks in Creole if he wants to signify that nothing has changed. It can be sensed on the docks where friends and relatives are waiting for him not only in the literal sense, but in the sense of waiting to catch him out. They need only 1 minute to make their diagnosis. If he says, "I am so happy to be back among you, good Lord, it's so hot in this place, I'm not sure I can put up with it for long," they have been forewarned. It's a European who's come back. To speak a language is to appropriate its world and culture. So, again, language is going to be a fundamental, as has been signaled in the first line of the first chapter, element of the analysis. The way that language structures our social interactions and is for others. The way that it signals to others how we're situating ourselves and orienting ourselves in the world, and how they're oriented in relation to us, what sort of things we can expect, and so on and so forth. Which is why it's so important for the language of the colonized peoples to be downgraded, if not eradicated, and the language of the colonizer to be adopted and enforced and viewed as a kind of marker, as some sort of social progress. That's the language of humanity within the colonial system, right? So one of the things I think it's important to recognize about this discussion, and I'll wrap the video on this last point, Fanon is really trying to embody and speak from the situation of colonization. So a lot of the things he's saying in Black Skin, White Masks are sort of like, oh wow, like this is really, you know, he seems to be able to express from the situation the terms of the system of colonization. And so he's not always making an obvious or polemical like criticism, like, oh, this is so terrible and I'm going to rail against it and so on and so forth. He certainly has moments in the text where he's going to do that. But a lot of the time he's almost speaking from the situation in such a way that just sort of lays it bare. Like, here's what it is. And let me describe it for you in a way. And so this language of dehumanization, of trying to be white, is sometimes sort of shocking, because there's times in the text where Fanon is talking about it relatively dispassionately in a very sort of descriptive way, and then switching to a more critical position where the language is a bit more polemical and on the offensive and on the attack against these ideas. So the reading Black Skin, White Masks, for me at least, can be very jarring because of the way in which Fanon presents these situations and contexts almost sort of at a distance. The book moves rhetorically between this sort of academic prose style of disinterestedness and, again, a very committed and attached, more passionate expression of criticisms that underscore the harm done by what's being described by these systems, the psychological havoc it wreaks, the psychological havoc that is visited upon the people who are colonized, and again, we'll see in other sections, the people who are doing the colonizing. So I will pick up there. Thanks for reading along with me. I'm pretty excited, but also very intimidated by this text, given my own historical racial situation and how I present to other people. So I hope you'll bear with me as we work through a difficult and engaging text, and I will see you in the next video.